It's probably the most replicable finding I've ever seen.
And we have in our data evidence that some people are reporting spending more than they have.
Industry's been very happy to share its research. When it comes to loot boxes, tumbleweeds.
I think that sort of speaks for itself, right?
Drummond and Jim Sauer are associate professors at the University of Tasmania and recently released a paper looking at loot box spending when normalized for disposable income measured against psychological distress. The two have studied a range of issues in games, from whether or not violent games affect aggression to the impact of games on learning. But when they entered the sphere of loot boxes, things were very different, for reasons I'll let them elaborate on. So, is loot box spending linked to greater distress? Let's find out. This idea of measuring loot box spending against psychological distress, there's been a couple of studies previously that have been done. Can you talk about where we're at in terms of the research and that whole idea of whether or not loot boxes are correlated with distress or whether they cause it? And can you talk also about how you engaged with that and extended it?
Sure. So, I mean, we started looking at loot boxes back in about 2018, and since then we know a few things about loot boxes, but there's still a lot to learn. So, the main finding that keeps popping out of the literature, and it's probably the most replicable finding I've ever seen in psychology, is the association between problem gambling symptomatology and loot box spending. So, there's this really robust relationship between the idea that people who are more at risk of gambling harm from conventional gambling activities spend more on loot boxes than people who are at lower risk of harm. And we don't know a lot about the causational nature of that. So we don't know whether engaging with loot boxes is causing people to become at risk of gambling harm and develop problematic gambling behaviors, or whether it is the case that just people who are at risk of gambling harm, loot boxes kind of appeal to them. There is some emerging longitudinal evidence that suggests there's probably a bit of a bi-directional relationship going on between those two things. And so there might be a bit of causing, one causing the other, and then also that reverse causality going on. But because it's such a new field still for psychology, it's not something we know a lot about the harmful consequences of and whether or not it is harmful per se. So one aspect of that is whether it's psychologically harmful, and that's sort of motivated our interest in distress. And what we are seeing now is more and more research that suggests that, both from our team and also from other teams internationally, that engaging with loot boxes is associated with psychological distress, particularly for those people who are spending more of their disposable income on and available resources on loot boxes per month.
I guess one thing I'd just add, when people first started to take an interest in loot boxes, it was because they appeared similar in a number of ways to conventional forms of gambling. And one of the early ideas that people kind of jumped on was this idea that perhaps loot boxes are a gateway to other gambling behaviors. And I think it's fair to say Aaron and I early on were skeptical. We were clear on the similarities between loot boxes and conventional forms of gambling, but we weren't sold on the idea that they were a pathway to conventional forms of gambling. More recently, there is actually data emerging that does show that they do sort of prompt migration. Some great work coming out of Canada in particular. But one of the things that's been really interesting to Aaron and I over the years we've been researching is loot boxes are interesting in and of themselves. They have the potential to cause harm or increase risks for consumers in and of themselves. They're not only interesting because they might be a pathway or a stepping stone to conventional gambling behavior. They have the potential to be associated with increased psychological distress, to be associated with increased consumer regret, and various other kinds of things.
When you say that loot boxes can kind of be harmful in themselves, are you talking about like a Skinner box type of system, or what are the ways that it can be harmful?
Well, I guess so. The first thing to note, you've raised the Skinner box idea. So yeah, I think that's a key point to note, is that loot boxes use what we call a schedule of reinforcement, a way of motivating behavior that's very similar to many conventional forms of gambling, and that they use intermittent reinforcement schedules. Now, what that means is that, let's start at the start. If you want to increase the likelihood someone will repeat a behavior, you reward that behavior, right? But the most interesting thing is that the most effective way to increase the repetition of behavior is not to reward every instance of the behavior, but to offer those rewards on a variable ratio or intermittent schedule, which means that the person knows that if they keep doing the behavior, they'll get a reward at some point, but they don't know exactly when that reward is going to come. So they keep doing the behavior because every time they do the behavior and don't get the reward, they feel that they're one step closer to the next time they will get a reward. And this works with everything from rats and pigeons pressing food pallets, through to monkeys doing cognitive tasks, the sips of juice, through to people throwing money into the pokies, right? So loot boxes operate on that same fundamental principle. You buy a loot box, you might get the shiny thing you want, you might get something you don't want, something that's not valuable, not useful, but you get this feeling that I didn't get a win this time, but if I buy another one, I might get it then. And so that promotes that behavior. And so then we link this to harm. So what this can lead to is over-engagement. Now, that over-engagement might have consequences for overspending, but it might have other kinds of consequences. It might have, as with conventional forms of gambling, over-engagement can have effects on social relationships, emotional well-being. Now, we don't know whether overspending with loot boxes necessarily has these kinds of additional consequences, but it has the potential to foster behavior that's perhaps excessive for at least some people. Do you think that's a fair summary?
Yeah. Yeah, I think everything you've said is quite reasonable in the way you put it. And I think the additional thing to point out there is when we talk about, increased engagement in and of itself isn't a bad thing. But one of the things that's true about intermittent reinforcement schedules is they tend to be a very hollow engagement that produces really rapid learning that's really hard to unlearn, right? And this kind of, mimics what we know gamers are saying about loot boxes. They don't really like them as a general rule. They want to be able to choose what they buy. And a bit of a thought experiment I always put to people is, well, if you went to the clothing store and you said, hey, I want to buy a new suit, and the person said, well, you can, but I'm not going to tell you whether it's black or white or whatever, you wouldn't accept that. But this is what gamers are being asked to accept all the time, right?
Yeah, that's funny. I mean, I always say there's no consumer-friendly version of a loot box. And that's, I've looked at the odds in terms of Valve's loot boxes. And because, Valve's a special case because they've got the Steam marketplace where you can attach a dollar figure as decided by the market to an item. And then they also had to disclose their odds for certain things because they wanted to operate in China. So, you can combine those two things and come out with the return rate of what a loot box is. And it turns out it's very, very far below the legal minimums around the world. Each state in Australia might have a legal minimum for what a slot machine or a pokie machine has to pay out. And, it might be 88% or it might be above 90%. But with these loot boxes, we're talking down in the level of 40, 50% or something like that. Do you think that when it's part of the reason the intermittent sort of random reward schedules stay interesting is because they're kind of unpredictable? And one thing I've noticed in myself, and this is kind of anecdotal, which I just want to bounce off you, is that when I started learning about these techniques that not just loot boxes, but World of Warcraft was using and pokie machines were using. When I started learning about them, I myself kind of felt less compelled to engage in those activities. Is that just is that just a, is that a thing for everyone? Is it the case that the more you learn about it, the less predictable it becomes, the more boring it becomes? Is that our greatest defense against it?
I wish that was so. I guess the point you got to realize is there are two categories of people here, and for many people, engaging with loot boxes, engaging with gambling, even in a conventional sense, is not necessarily harmful because they're able to do it to a level that is safe, right? For their circumstances. What we're talking about is that there is a small population of people who tend to over-engage in activities, and these people tend to be at risk of gambling harm. They tend to be at risk of over expenditure. And that's why there's kind of rules and limits set up around conventional forms of gambling to make sure that those people who are most vulnerable in society are not harmed by those activities. And so while, your average consumer might be able to learn more about the schedules of loot boxes and see the hollowness of those reinforcement schedules and be less compelled by them, there are still people out there who, when they learn about these things, feel the need to continue to go and engage with them to excess. And those are the people that we're particularly concerned about as psychological scientists.
And to add to that, there's also the idea that engagement with loot boxes doesn't exist in a vacuum. Loot boxes are embedded in games, and gaming for a lot of people represents a key leisure activity, and for a lot of other people, a social activity. And part of sort of, belonging in those communities may be, may relate to how well you can perform in the game, or the appearance of your in-game avatar. And in some gaming contexts, your ability to customize your avatar, your ability to perform in competitive gaming environments may be tied to whether or not you can get the rewards that come from loot boxes. And so the motivation to engage with loot boxes and obtain items that are only available through loot boxes isn't a thing that exists in itself. It's related to satisfying needs in that gaming context that's important to people for a bunch of reasons. So even if you're in a situation where you feel like, where you're aware that this is like, the example I argue, even when you're aware that you're walking into the suit store and being like, I want a suit, and he's like, the best I can do for you is give you this box. Even if you're aware that's not cool, you kind of, you have to either engage with it or forego some of that connection that you want with that community.
Sometimes you need a suit.
Right?
Yeah.
Sometimes you got to get a suit. You just got to buy the box and hope for the best, I guess, right? So that again makes it a complex environment where it's not as simple as people saying, I'm not a fan of this mechanism, so I'm not engaging,
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. Your study that you recently released was looking at loot box spending against psychological distress when normalized for disposable income. And I want to drill down on disposable income, but just before we do, can you briefly describe what normalization means in this context?
Yeah, so what we were looking at is rather than looking at how much people were spending in a raw sense, looking at how much people are spending relative or as a ratio of how much available disposable income they had. And so I think this is a really important thing for us as a field to be doing, is to be looking not just at how much people are spending, but how much are people spending relative to their available finances and resources. Because what's $1 or $2 to someone who has a regular income is probably not much, but there are people out there, obviously, who we saw in our data sets who are reporting spending more than their entire disposable income on loot boxes each month.
When we look at data sets and these different sections of people who spend, and there's always like a small proportion of people who spend like a vastly disproportionate amount of money, and these people are always talked about in terms of whales, and it's the assumption there is that they have the disposable income to maintain the spending in a sort of sustainable way. But the sort of unsaid thing there is that they might not be a whale, they might just be someone who is overspending. And so does this using disposable income as a yardstick, does that sort of introduce that distinction? Does it help us distinguish the whales from those who are being harmed?
Yeah, that's certainly one of the ways of doing it, and that was the reason we wanted to normalise disposable income. But it's really important to say that this is not the only study that speaks against that idea of a whale when it comes to loot boxes. Jim and I had a PhD student, Eamon Garrett, who ran a study looking at the breakdown of spending across different problem gambling categories. And what you find is in every income category, it's always problem gamblers who are spending the most, even at the low income categories. So it's always the problem gamblers, those people who are at risk of gambling harm, who are overspending on loot boxes, and not necessarily just wealthy gamers. So that doesn't appear to be a whale. That appears to be a bit of a myth, according to at least our data sets.
Wow. So we can kind of confidently say that the highest spenders are being harmed.
I think in general, we can't make definitive claims about who is harmed and who is not. But what we can say is that we know that there are these characteristics that are positively associated with spending. And we have in our data evidence that some people are reporting spending more than they have in sort of disposable income, which we would argue is kind of quintessentially financial harm. Does that make sense? I'm trying to be responsible in the way we.
I think what Jim's trying to do, and I think it's absolutely the issue here is, as responsible scientists, based on the data we have, we suspect that there is harm going on, but we're not at a point where that the evidence is overwhelming to us, so we've got to be cautious. And one of the challenges that we've experienced here is that the data that we have available to us is often what gamers tell us about what they're doing, but we don't have access to the closed data sets that are quite detailed, we'd imagine, that industry has. And there's no industry sharing of those data about who's buying the loot boxes, what sort of finances they have, even if they've got those estimates. And so that makes it very difficult for us to know exactly what's going on at an industry level. And the best we can do is kind of ask gamers what their experience is, and then kind of use that as a proxy measure.
It was asked of gamers to tell what their disposable income was.
Yeah.
And in some cases, they were reporting that they were spending more on loot boxes. The amount that they were spending was over what they said their entire disposable income was.
Yeah, that's correct. And I mean, what's interesting about that is it kind of maps onto what we see in a lot of our data sets over time is when we started this work, we noticed about 1 to 5% of people in our data set report really high expenditure. And initially we thought maybe these are, not genuine responses, or maybe these are outliers. But over time, as we've collected more and more data, and there's been this consistent pattern of people saying they're spending, sometimes up to $1,000 a month on loot boxes, we've started to think, well, actually, the more times you see that, the more likely it is that there is this small group of maybe 1 to 5% somewhere in that region who are really spending quite a lot on loot boxes.
And one of the data sets you looked at, loot box spending wasn't associated with increased distress when normalized to disposable income. These long sentences that you have to get out when you're talking about the academic stuff, they're a mouthful. That study, I think, was by Leon Zhao, who, if you're watching this podcast or listening to it right now, probably the last episode was with Leon Zhao. That study was using a 6-item scale of distress. So what's the difference between the 6 and the 10-item scale?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. So we're not exactly sure whether it was the difference in the scale that was causing that, or the difference in cultural differences, because Leon's sample, of course, comes from mainland China, whereas the actual data set that we reanalyzed is from all over the place, predominantly European and North American data coming out of those data sets. So it could be a cultural issue. It could be something to do with the scale. The main difference between the 10-item scale and the 6-item scale, and I don't have them to hand, is this kind of trying to get at the same level of distress with fewer items. But what concerned me is that 6-item scale did not correlate in Leon's data set with basic problem gambling symptomatology. And you always see that people with problem gambling symptomatology tend to be more psychologically distressed. So that's a bit of a red flag for me. And I'm not sure whether that's to do with the cultural issue. And if it is, then we need a lot more research and understanding cultural differences in gambling, between mainland China and elsewhere, or whether actually it's something to do with the scale, or whether it was just, sometimes you get sort of false negative findings like that.
I mean, you've said that, you kind of came in skeptical. How is that different, when you approached the loot box issue from issues that you've approached in the past? Because you mentioned that your earlier research into video games was more along the lines of violent games and whether or not they cause aggression, and whether or not games inhibit learning and schoolwork. So how has this issue been different for you from those issues?
We kind of got into that early work looking at the violent video game literature, effects of violence on player cognition and behavior, and looking at the effects of gameplay on academic performance from this idea of an existing field where a narrative had emerged that certain types of video gameplay had negative consequences for gamers. And so we went into that field wanting to just check some of these conclusions by doing our own research. one of the key differences, I think, when it came to loot boxes was there was no field to go into. And I remember one Friday we're sitting there having this chat because, you know, Reddit's just blown up about loot boxes, and Belgium's talking about banning loot boxes, and the governor of Hawaii's talking about loot boxes being gambling and banning it. And we were kind of sitting here thinking, like, it would be really useful to provide some scientific basis for discussion on this issue. And I think we kind of thought, look, we could see intuitively that there appear to be some similarities between loot boxes and gambling. So let's try to look at that systematically. And Aaron had this great idea. Well, what we could actually do is we could just look at games that have loot boxes, and then we could take these psychological criteria for gambling developed by Mark Griffiths and just see, look, do these loot box systems actually meet the psychological criteria for gambling? So that was what we did in our first paper, and it sort of showed that a good proportion of these games or these loot box systems met the majority of these psychological criteria.
And importantly, when I went to map on those criteria, I was fully expecting to find that they wouldn't meet most of the criteria for gambling. Because of the moral panics that have been targeted at gaming in the past, I was kind of the opinion it probably would be a storm in a teacup. But, when I started to actually sit there, I'm sitting there with my cup of coffee, and the more that I'm noting down about the criteria, I'm starting to think, oh, that's actually not good. It looks really similar to conventional forms of gambling. I think the other point that you raise comes back to the difference between previous research and this is that we've been very cautious to try to keep the focus on a feature, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is a feature of games. It's one aspect. This is not about games are bad. This is about something within games, something that gamers themselves say they're not particularly fond of. And keeping that focus on the feature, it means that it's about making sure that everyone can have fun in their games in a responsible way.
One of the things Aaron said there nails a key difference. When we talk about the violent video game literature or the effects of gaming on education, what that typically was people who are not gamers pointing at gaming and saying that's bad for you, and which may or may not be true, but it's that external kind of view of the activity. The loot box thing is motivated at least as much by the fact that gamers point to this thing and say, we're not fans. Now, loot boxes make a lot of revenue, so clearly gamers are engaging with this, and some gamers may well enjoy engaging with the loot boxes, but a significant proportion of the community look at this as something that they're like, this is not something I enjoy doing. This is not an aspect of my gaming experience that I find valuable. And that's a fascinating situation to be in terms of how this research differs from previous work. And so I guess, even once we started to, as Aaron said, we start to look at how these systems map onto these gambling criteria, and we're starting to realize that there's potentially something here. Still, at each point in the process, you go, okay, we know that there are these psychological similarities. All right. That doesn't mean that there's harm. We need to actually go get data to establish, well, okay, what can we find out about the people who tend to engage more or less with these systems? What can we find out about the consequences of engaging with these systems? So at each point, you've still got that skepticism. You're not kind of jumping on, we showed that some loot boxes meet psychological criteria for gambling, therefore, moral panic. It's about that systematic development of a body of knowledge that helps to inform our understanding. So,
and again, at each point, we'd been surprised by the findings. Like for many years, Jim and I were of the perspective that it was unlikely that engaging with loot boxes would lead people into conventional forms of gambling. But when Luke Clark and Gabrielle Brooks published their longitudinal work showing that, in fact, players who are buying loot boxes are migrating in, we're forced to adjust our views based on the available data. And so, it seems that at many points when we thought, okay, well, that's probably not a thing, we've actually been surprised to find that there has been evidence for that. So it's that cautious approach that we try to take.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's one of the things I'm trying to do with this podcast as well, is try to get the science out there, because I think, I'm thankful for a lot of media who has properly reported on loot boxes and sort of taken that on as a beat. But still, there are a lot of media who I think fall into this mode reflexively of defending games.
I actually think you've got almost a bimodal distribution in terms of the way media approaches the topic of gaming and gaming related consequences. I think it's not uncommon in some media outlets for that narrative to be pushed, that games are a problem. And in other contexts, perhaps you get more of the pushback, like, no, games aren't. But what I would say, sort of in a historical context, is gaming is just the latest iteration. Like it used to be satanic lyrics backwards in Led Zeppelin songs, and then it was, like it was Arnold Schwarzenegger and Stallone films in the 80s, and then it was gangster rap in the 90s, and and now it's games. There can be a tendency to pathologize certain activities, and it's very rarely that simple. And sometimes jumping too hard on one particular cause actually obscures more important causes. And so when it comes to gaming as one example of a cause that's been pointed to in some contexts, we take that skeptical thing because we think it's not about the narrative people create. What does the data actually tell us?
And look, I think the other point, right, is gamers, because they've been fighting these battles for 20 years, many of us feel like we've been having to fight the battle for gaming for a very long time. And when you're in a foxhole like that under constant attack, I think the natural response when someone says, oh, but there might be a problem with this thing, is to immediately push back and try and defend games. But what's really fascinating, we try to be as moderate as we can, which tends to mean that people on both sides either claim our arguments for their own or push us to the other side and say, no, they're too extreme in that direction.
What sort of criticisms do they level at your research? And is one more able to steel man than the other? It seems to me like the process is the process, right? Like, in terms of science, like we ask questions and what we find is what we find.
One of the criticisms that we've received, because in this context we are moving towards a conclusion that there are some legitimate harms associated with engaging with loot boxes for at least some people. One criticism that we've received is that we've jumped on the gaming is bad bandwagon. That we're facilitating moral panic, which I don't want to speak out of turn, but I think has disappointed both of us, because that's exactly the opposite of what we've tried to do. So we have, we've had certain camps sort of point to our work as if we're making a storm in a teacup. At the same time, almost simultaneously, we had some work reviewed by one camp that were like, "Nah, you're making too much of this," and work reviewed by another camp that's like, "Nah, you're downplaying this too much. You're not being clear enough about the actual issues." So it honestly has been both sides, because we're moderate. We're kind of in the middle. Like, the data are what they are.
I guess none of the criticisms, like, are any of the criticisms about your process? Because, like, if the process is solid, you're off the hook, right? Like, you can just say, if you all want to discuss the ramifications of it and, the flow-on effects and all that, that's fine. But this kind of is what it is, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think if you think about the process, no science is perfect, right? And we're in a situation where, if we had a certain amount of funding, a perfect study might be to go out and get people's banking data, as well as, a whole bunch of spending data that's objective from industry, and link those things together and try and figure out exactly how much people are spending over time. But with a limited amount of funding, a limited pool of funding, with limited data transparency from industry, suddenly that becomes more complicated. So one of the criticisms, and I think there's something to this, is that we are forced into a position where we ask people how much they spend, and obviously people may not report that accurately, or they may decide to report it but try to be accurate but not remember the information very well, because we don't all keep perfect track of our spending. So we've been forced into a position of trying to use those data as best as we can, with all the caveats that come alongside them, which is one of the reasons that we're so cautious about saying, well, we're not convinced yet that we can definitely say it's harm. We need more data on this issue, and that softly approach. So, I mean, there are criticisms of the process, and I think those criticisms need to be put back to a certain degree back on industry and back on, kind of funders, because really what we need to do more work is better funding and better data transparency at the industry level so that we can understand what's really going on at an objective level. And that's sort of something that Jim and I are trying to work on.
The other thing to bear in mind with the scientific process is you recruit data from a group of people that you hope will be representative of the people in the real world that you're interested in. And based on that data, we find evidence that problem gambling symptomatology is associated with loot box spending. Okay. And we find a certain, an index that suggests the association between these two things is of a certain strength. Now we've followed the process. The process is the process, but it doesn't end there, because based on what we find in studies, we kind of infer what things are likely to be, how well this represents situations out in the real world, in the broader population of interest, right? So it's not just about what have we shown in our data set, it's what does that mean in real world settings. And so one of the criticisms you can get, even if the process of collecting those data and interpreting those data is fine, you can still have people who argue, well, yes, but what you found there isn't necessarily all that informative about what's happening out in the real world where people are spending real dollars or whatever it might be. And so you can kind of receive those kind of criticisms as well, that argue, oh no, you're overgeneralizing the findings you've got you're making too much of the issue. And that's a sort of a common criticism in this.
Yeah, that's a point that came up with Leon Chow as well, is when we were talking about, if industry would share data more with researchers, it would be a big help. And one thing that sticks out in my mind that he mentioned was that when it comes to, research on violent games, industry's been very happy to share their research. When it comes to video game addiction and whether or not it disrupts schoolwork, industry's been very happy to share its research. When it comes to loot boxes, tumbleweeds.
Yeah, I think that sort of speaks for itself, right?
Absolutely. I guess the whole, violent video game thing has become, it becomes relevant every 6 months or so, whenever a mass shooting happens and a politician blames it on video games. And, of course, the recent public event is the death of Charlie Kirk, and RFK Jr. came out and mentioned video games quite soon after the killing. So this is... it's been once again raised to the top of political discussion. There are, leaders of companies like Discord and Twitch and Valve being told to come to Congress and talk about it. Feel free to say no, that you don't want to say anything, but as to folks who have researched violence in video games, is it worth devoting just a minute or two just to say, definitively, here's what the science says about this?
Yeah, I mean, we can speak to that. I'm not sure that we've come to a definitive conclusion on that. There tends to be sort of two camps on the issue of violent video games. I think over time, the evidence is accumulating towards the idea that violent video games, if they have an impact on people's aggression, it's probably reasonably mild and probably very small. Now, there's a distinction to be made there. That doesn't mean that for some players, there might be impacts. And those impacts might be quite large for at least some players. But for the majority of people, the tiny effect sizes we see don't tend to imply that people are going to become much more aggressive from playing these things. And so, there is that issue of there's always going to be people who are unfortunately violent and aggressive, and that's why we have laws and other things to govern that. But I don't think that is actually being caused by the violent video games, not based on the data that I'm seeing, at least.
I'd go a step further. I again, wanting to be cautious, appropriately cautious, but when we look at the data as a whole and we look at the direction in which that research field is heading, I think what we can show is that where there are associations between exposure to violent video game content and either aggressive cognition or aggressive behavior, those effects are small, and they get smaller as study quality gets better. I think that's a really important point. As the field has become more aware of how to do the best possible science, as studies get better, as studies do more of the best practice, the effects they observe are getting smaller and smaller, and in some cases are indistinguishable from zero. So again, then to back Aaron's point, that doesn't mean that for some players, exposure to content might that for some players, exposure to this kind of content might have problematic outcomes. But on the whole, the evidence that exposure to violent video game content has a meaningful effect on important real world violence, the evidence is not strong at all. And again, because there's a difference between, you're in a lab and you're measuring the effects of exposure to violent media content on violent cognition, or no, aggressive cognition. That's a long way from saying exposure, like playing violent video games, will make you go out and be violent to other people. And the evidence to support that conclusion is really not strong. Do you think that's fair, Aaron?
Yeah, I think everything you said is fair there.
Thank you very much for that. I wanted to sort of drill down on one thing that you mentioned, Jim, when we were talking about how loot boxes don't operate in a vacuum. They're often a feature of a larger game, and often when we talk about games, we can look at them through the lens of like intrinsic and extrinsic rewards. The intrinsic stuff is the stuff that you do more for the joy of doing it. And the extrinsic stuff is more being told that you're having fun, numbers going up and good job and a big plume and fanfare and all this sort of thing. And loot boxes are obviously more geared towards the extrinsic side of things. But I guess it occurred to me that, when you're talking about how the features of a loot box, and not just loot box, but all extrinsic features of games are kind of intertwined with these intrinsic parts of games, to the extent where it's almost like you can't enjoy some of the intrinsic stuff without engaging with loot boxes. Is it possible for like the intrinsic and the extrinsic to be tied together in a way like that?
Absolutely. I mean, rewards are inherently extrinsic, and we know that. So again, to take it back a step, yes, we know that typically intrinsic motivation is associated with better outcomes. If we're intrinsically motivated, we get more reward from what we're doing. We feel better about what we're doing. It's positive. We're more productive. We're happier. Whereas extrinsic motivation, it sort of shifts. You're not doing it for the joy of doing it. You're doing it because you're getting paid or because whatever. But extrinsic rewards can still have positive effects if those extrinsic rewards support the intrinsic motivation, right? You can't replace intrinsic motivation with extrinsic motivation without some drop, but if the extrinsic motivation kind of augments that intrinsic, if it supports it, you'll still get that same kind of engagement. Now, this is where loot boxes are, I think, interesting because, as you've pointed out, they're extrinsic, but they're tied to your intrinsic motivation to play the game. They're leveraging the fact that you're intrinsically motivated to engage with this activity. Let's be honest, in order to extract money from you. Like that's at least when we talk about paid loot boxes, they're a revenue making mechanism. They're not in there. Well, sorry, I'm getting speculative here, but I would argue they're not in there because they make the game more enjoyable for the consumer. They're in there because they're an effective way to leverage that consumer's connection to the game to extract more revenue. That would be my take on that issue.
Just briefly, was there anything about your study that I neglected to mention that you wanted to talk about?
No, not really. I mean, I think the only thing I would add is that, this is by far not the end of the road for understanding loot boxes and their effects. And there are, as we go back to that study, we know that the way disposable income was reported in those studies was to ask people how much money do you have and how much money do you have disposable over the last month. And we know that that's not necessarily the best way to get at it. So there's still a lot to be done to really unpack how how much loot boxes are affecting players, particularly financially and particularly psychologically, so that we can really understand, how and where a safe limit is for players, and how safe they are for players to be engaging with. And one thing that I think Jim highlighted with his point about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation is, if you end up burning out all your players' goodwill through extrinsic rewards that they have to pay money for, that's not a very good business model long term. And I don't think it's we've seen time and time again that players tend to have bad will towards those kind of practices. So I think it's one of those things that a good, positive, sustainable business model moving forward really does need to think about players and the financial impacts of things like loot boxes, and the psychological impacts of them as well. And if I may, one of the key points that Jim and I always talk about is we're not, when we talk about this stuff, we're not trying to confect a moral panic. And in fact, what we would like is for people to have all the information at their fingertips to be able to make informed decisions for themselves and their kids about whether to engage with this stuff. They need to be aware of what the risks are. They need to understand what they are, and they need to be informed and then be able to make an informed decision for themselves. This is not about us telling people what to do. It's about people knowing what the risks are and being able to tell for themselves and their own kids what they think is right.
100%. Yeah, those are great points. Yeah, I'm kind of reminded of, the last episode that we put up with Einar Hawkinson as a monetization expert, and he was talking about that, short-term benefit that some companies, they try to make those short-term profits at the expense of goodwill and stuff like that. And he actually filters his clients by talking about, whether or not they think Diablo 4's monetization was good or not. But listen, we're out of time. I've been kind of speeding through my questions, but I've been enjoying this chat very much. There's a ton of stuff to talk about. I'm sure, if you guys are willing, I'd love to have you back on sometime. Aaron Drummond, Jim Sauer, thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been great, Jeremy.
Thanks for the opportunity. Cheers.